If you'd asked me 6 months ago what the most peaceful sound in the world was, I would have said the gentle trickle of the creek behind my home. Nestled at the edge of our sleepy cul-de-sac, the water had always been my escape, a natural boundary between my property and the HOA-controlled chaos that simmered in our neighborhood like an overboiled pot. The creek wasn't just water, it was rhythm.com, nature's reminder that some things flowed, regardless of paperwork and power plays. But then, Karen moved in. You know the type: sunglasses, even on cloudy days, clipboard clutched like a weapon, and the uncanny ability to smile at you while ruining your life in slow motion. She was elected HOA president within 2 weeks of arriving, thanks to a neighborhood vote that no one really thought mattered. But it did, because Karen believed in order. And she believed that the natural world should bend to her definition of aesthetically pleasing. The problems started small. First, she mailed me a warning about the unauthorized bird feeders I had hanging from my back porch. Then came the complaint about my lawn being 0.5 inches taller than the length. I laughed it off, assuming she was just overzealous. New presidents always try to make a statement. But then she turned her eyes to the creek. At first, I thought it was just curiosity. She'd stand near the edge with a notebook, measuring tapes, dangling from her purse, sometimes taking photos while muttering under her breath. When I finally asked what she was doing, she gave a tight-lipped smile and said, "Just ensuring everything's within code." You know how water can cause liability issues? I didn't like the way she said liability, like it was a loaded word, like it meant this won't be your creek much longer. I later found out she had filed a motion to reclaim the unmonitored waterway and redirect it underground, supposedly to prevent flooding risks and enhance property values. It sounded absurd. The creek had been running naturally for over 60 years, long before our HOA even existed. I went to the next community board meeting to challenge it, but by the time I arrived, the vote had already happened in her favor. She gave me a cold glance when I stood up to speak. "The water doesn't belong to you," she said flatly. "It's a shared community asset, and the HOA has final jurisdiction, but it runs through my land." "Not entirely," she said, "and the parts that do are part of the watershed. You'll find the clause on page 72 of the HOA guidelines." Footnote C. That was Karen's weapon of choice. Bureaucracy. For a while, I thought that was the end of it, that maybe she'd file some paperwork and the whole thing would die in a sea of red tape. But I underestimated her need to win. Not just win. Dominate. The cement arrived on a Thursday morning. I remember the sky was gray, and the air smelled like rain. I stepped out to grab my paper, and that's when I heard the grinding churn of a portable cement mixer. I rounded the back of my property and froze. There, standing like some deranged artist at work, was Karen. She was wearing plastic boots, thick gloves, and a floral windbreaker that did nothing to hide her sense of pride. Beside her, a construction worker poured fresh, gray cement directly into the creek bed. A thick, goopy dam already stretched halfway across the water. "What the hell are you doing?" I yelled, heart racing. Karen didn't even flinch. She gestured casually to the worker, who paused. "I'm executing a community-approved drainage plan," she said, loud and rehearsed. "The creek will be sealed and redirected underground, as per Article 5 subsection B. That plan doesn't give you the right to destroy natural land. This is on my property." She didn't answer. Instead, she stepped forward, as if to make her presence larger, more official. "It's not personal," she said. "It's policy." The worker continued pouring. The water, already muddy and angry, began to swirl higher along the banks. Trapped behind the rising wall of cement, fish darted in confusion beneath the surface. A frog leaped from the edge, almost getting caught in the slurry. I wanted to stop it, to scream, to shove the mixer into the creek and make her watch as nature took back what she was trying to bury. But I didn't, because in that moment, something more dangerous than anger took root in me. I made a silent promise. If she wanted a war over water, then so be it. Karen didn't just hate the creek. She feared it, but that wasn't obvious at first. On the surface, she acted like the water was simply an inconvenience, a mess, a hazard, an eyesore she needed to tidy up with her obsessive brand of suburban micromanagement. But like all true control freaks, her battles weren't just about what could be seen. They were about something deeper. I started digging. Not literally, though. Later, that would come too, but metaphorically. I asked around. I talked to neighbors who had lived here longer than me, even a few who had served on past HOA boards before Karen took over like a virus in pearls. "She's got a thing about water," one of them whispered at a community yard sale, eyes darting like Karen. "Might pop out of the shrubs with a clipboard. Lost her last house in a flood or something. She never talks about it, but she goes nuts whenever there's a puddle." I looked it up. Public records, news articles. She used to live 2 states over, in a fancy tucked-away development near a riverbank. Her house, a massive custom-built monstrosity, had suffered major flood damage during a freak spring storm. Not just water in the basement. We're talking foundation damage, mold infestation, insurance battle, the works. And guess what? The town had refused to approve her request to divert the river's edge. She'd filed for petitions, lost all of them. Then she sold the property at a loss, moved here, and no surprise immediately joined the HOA. That's when it clicked. The creek reminded her of her failure, and she couldn't let it exist without trying to dominate it. But in the process, she began dominating everything else. Under her leadership, the HOA became less of a governing body and more of a regime. She installed surveillance cameras at the neighborhood entrances. She required weekly lawn reports from residents, citing environmental consistency standards. She even proposed a color palette for acceptable flower types. No reds, because they were too aggressive. I once watched her write up an 82-year-old widow for leaving her trash cans out 12 minutes past pickup time. Karen didn't just enforce rules. She created them. She used bylaws like daggers and meetings like battlefields, and anyone who resisted found themselves buried under letters, fines, or in my case, concrete. The more I learned about her past, the more her obsession with my creek made sense. See, in her last neighborhood, she'd tried to fight nature and lost. Here, she thought she had the upper hand. She couldn't change the weather, but she could change the water, only. She forgot one crucial truth. Nature remembers. I remembered something else, too. Something she said at that board meeting, just before the vote. It had stuck in my head, like a splinter. When water is left unregulated, it becomes dangerous. It doesn't belong to anyone, and that's the problem. That line haunted me, because she wasn't just talking about my creek. She was talking about anything, or anyone that didn't fit into her perfectly squared little world. Karen couldn't tolerate unpredictability. She didn't just hate the chaos. She feared it, and rather than deal with the discomfort, she would rather bury it in cement and pretend it never existed. But the funny thing about water is, it doesn't forget, and it doesn't go away. It builds, it waits, and when the time is right, it returns with a vengeance. That thought followed me one evening as I stood on the edge of the now silent creek bed, staring at the cement dam that had turned flowing water into a swampy, stagnant pool. The frogs were gone, the cattails were dying, and Karen Welsh had started construction on her rain-proofed basement renovation, complete with marble tile, recessed lighting, and wine racks. She had no idea she was building it on a pressure cooker. But I did. And I wasn't the only one. One by one, neighbors started noticing things. Their gardens were drying up. The ground was shifting in places it shouldn't. Mosquitoes were multiplying, and the smell, that awful swampy rot, started creeping into the summer air. I began collecting photos. Time-stamped evidence. I started mapping the natural flow of the creek from old county records. I even found an old forgotten permit from the 1980s that proved part of the waterway was federally protected, something the HOA hadn't noticed. Karen may have used the HOA as a shield, but I had something stronger, truth. And as I stood there that night, flashlight in hand, watching the still water glisten behind that grotesque wall of gray, I realized something else. Karen hadn't just declared war on the creek, she'd declared war on nature itself, and nature was about to answer. They say the law is blind, but in my neighborhood, it wore pearls and had a clipboard. After Karen cemented the creek, I knew I couldn't just yell and hope it would fix things. She thrived on emotional reactions. They gave her something to twist. So I decided to do what she never expected. I went quiet, and then I went legal. The first thing I did was contact the county water management office. I figured, surely someone out there would care that a civilian had just dammed a natural water flow with literal concrete. The clerk on the phone sounded confused at first. Double quotes, she, filled in a live creek. Yeah, I said, right through the middle of my property. There was a pause. That's not just against code. That might be a federal violation if it's part of the watershed. I smiled for the first time in days. They sent an inspector out within the week. He walked the area, took notes, snapped dozens of photos, and promised to file an environmental impact report. For the first time since Karen declared war, I felt like the tide might be turning. But Karen was always 2 moves ahead. When the inspector tried to access HOA records about the creek's designation and historical path, he hit a wall. Suddenly, the HOA files were incomplete. Some documents had gone missing, others had been amended. Karen claimed the HOA had voted 2 years prior to reroute all non-landscaped water features for safety, and guess what? The minutes magically supported her claim. I confronted her at the next HOA meeting. The room was packed with curious neighbors who had started to smell something rotten, both literally and politically. You forged meeting records, I said calmly, holding up a printout. This document is dated a week before you even moved into the neighborhood. Karen didn't flinch. I didn't forge anything, she said smoothly. The records were updated for clarity. We've always had drainage concerns in that section, so the vote to reroute the creek that happened without me, the property owner, even being notified. She tilted her head. It's common ground. You may think it's yours, but by code, anything that affects multiple lots is under jurisdiction. I could feel my blood boiling, but I kept my voice even. Then why does the county map list the creek as a private feature? A beat past. Outdated records, she said. We're working with the county to have that corrected. And just like that, she smiled. The room was silent. Even the neighbors who had begun to doubt her didn't know what to say. Karen knew how to talk in a way that sounded legal, sounded official, even if it was built on lies. She didn't just bend the rules. She rewrote them, but I wasn't done. That night, I dug deeper into real government records. I stayed up until 3 a.m. combing through environmental maps, zoning documents, even scanned microfilm from the county archive, and then I found it, a decades-old zoning document, stamped in blue ink, from 1982. It listed the creek as part of a protected wetland, corridor 1 that had been grandfathered in before our neighborhood was even developed. That meant the HOA had zero jurisdiction to alter it. Any changes had to go through county or even federal review. This was my trump card, or so I thought. I brought the document to the next meeting. I read aloud from it. I handed out copies to the board and even emailed them to every homeowner. There was buzz. People started whispering, asking questions. Karen's smile thinned, but she didn't break. Instead, she pivoted. "Thank you for bringing this up," she said sweetly. "And if this document turns out to be authentic, we'll of course comply. But in the meantime, we have an active drainage contract with a licensed contractor. We can't just halt a project midstream based on unverified historical paperwork." A hand shot up from the back. "Mr. Klein, a retired attorney who lived 3 doors down?" "Actually," he said, voice rough, "if this is accurate, the HOA could be facing civil and criminal penalties for environmental damage." Karen's mask cracked. The room stirred. Finally, momentum. Finally, someone else was speaking up that night. Karen filed a cease and desist against me, claimed I was harassing the HOA, interfering with contractual obligations, and spreading defamatory misinformation. I opened the letter and laughed. It was clearly meant to scare me, a toothless threat printed on expensive letterhead, but it told me something more important than anything in those pages. She was scared, and scared people make mistakes. I filed a counterclaim with the county, citing the environmental code and requesting an emergency injunction to stop any further construction. They agreed to review the case. A hearing was set for 2 weeks out. Those 2 weeks felt like a pressure cooker. On the surface, everything was quiet, too quiet. Karen didn't speak to me. The construction paused, but the cement remained. Neighbors started choosing sides. Some supported her, claiming the smell and bugs were worse than ever. Others had begun to doubt her story, especially after the documents I'd shared. Then the storm came, a freak summer squall. Unexpected and vicious. It hit in the middle of the night, dumping inches of rain in just hours. Thunder cracked like gunshots. Lightning split the sky. I didn't sleep, and at 3:12 a.m., I got a call. It was from a neighbor, breathless, almost laughing. "You need to come outside right now," he said. "Karen's basement. You're not going to believe this." I pulled on boots, grabbed a flashlight, and walked to the edge of the property where the old creek used to flow. The water was back, and it wasn't flowing. It was rising. You know that feeling before something terrible happens, when the world gets too quiet, too still, like it's holding its breath. That's exactly what the neighborhood felt like after the storm passed. Karen's basement wasn't underwater yet, not completely. When I arrived at the edge of the property line that morning, flashlight still in hand, I saw it for myself. The creek had overflown behind her home and was now pooling at the rear of her foundation. The water hadn't broken through, but it had risen several inches up the exterior wall. The grass was spongy, thick with mud, and the air smelled of rot and something worse. Mildew, maybe, or the sickly sweetness of stagnant water starting to fester. Karen stood on her patio in a robe, staring out across the yard like a general, surveying a battlefield, but she looked smaller now. The confidence was still there, but it was cracked, brittle. She saw me. Our eyes met. She didn't wave, didn't scold, didn't say a word. Maybe even she could feel it. The tide had shifted. Over the next few days, the neighborhood, divided like fault lines, had opened beneath our streets. Some people still backed her, mainly those in the pristine cul-de-sac homes who had always admired her strict policies. To them, order meant safety. If Karen had told them water was the enemy, they believed it, but others had started to whisper. Mrs. Patel, who lived 2 houses down from the creek, came to me one evening with a mug of tea and a worried frown. "My hydrangeas are dying," she said softly. "They've been blooming for years. Now the roots are waterlogged." She wasn't the first dot. The blocked creek wasn't just flooding Karen's yard. It was pushing water sideways, under fences, through soil. Foundations were beginning to feel it. Lawns turned swampy. One neighbor's dog got sick after drinking from the standing water. I tried contacting the HOA again, not to Karen directly, but to the rest of the board. I presented new photos, damage reports, weather projections, silence. Every time I asked for a response, I was told they were reviewing the matter internally. Translation: Karen was still in control. Meanwhile, her construction project resumed, louder than ever. Workers began reinforcing her basement walls with waterproof barriers. Giant industrial fans blasted from the lower level, and sump pumps rattled through the night. She even had sandbags placed at her property edge, facing the creek. It was like watching someone try to hold back the ocean with duct tape. The irony was lost on no one. Every day that passed without action made the damage worse. The soil was shifting beneath driveways. Patches of algae bloomed in people's backyards. Bugs swarmed near dusk like they were rising from hell itself. It wasn't just annoying. It was dangerous. And then the animals started fleeing. Birds vanished. Frogs, the last few that remained, were seen hopping away toward the woods. Squirrels wouldn't even cross the low-lying areas anymore. One morning, I found a dead fish in my flower bed. That was the tipping point for me. I called the county, again, this time, demanding action. The clerk was apologetic but firm. We've submitted the case to the Environmental Review Board. Their decision is pending. Until then, we can't override the HOA's internal jurisdiction unless there's proven criminal negligence. I almost laughed. What more did they need? A drowned child. A house collapse. So I did what I should have done sooner. I started documenting everything. I created a Google Drive folder. Every photo, every document, every neighbor complaint went into it. I set up a time-lapse camera pointing at the creek, logging the rising water levels. I even had Mr. Klein, the retired lawyer, help me draft an independent neighborhood petition, one demanding Karen step down until an independent audit could be completed within days. Half the block had signed it, but Karen wasn't going to give up easily. One afternoon, I came home to find a city code enforcement officer standing in my driveway, clipboard in hand. He looked embarrassed. I was told to inspect your shed, he said. There was an anonymous report about improper storage of lawn chemicals near a water source. Of course, Karen's retaliation. He walked around, snapped a few photos, and gave me a nod. You're fine, he said. This was a waste of time, but it proved something important. She was still watching, still trying to fight, still believing she had time. She didn't, because that night, the rain came back harder this time. Not a storm, not a squall, just a relentless steady downpour that lasted 14 hours straight. And when the clouds finally cleared, the damage revealed itself in layers. Floodwater wasn't creeping anymore. It was spilling. Neighbors woke to find basements leaking, even on higher ground. Driveways crumbled slightly where the soil had softened. Tree roots surfaced like veins through the mud. In Karen's backyard. Gone. The creek had risen enough to breach the cement wall on the upstream side. The pressure had built so intensely that a jagged crack now ran down the dam's center. Water wasn't rushing over it. It was coming through it. Like the earth itself was reclaiming what she'd stolen. By sunset, word had spread through the entire neighborhood. People gathered on porches, watching, whispering, taking videos. Some stared silently. Others snickered, not out of cruelty, but disbelief. This was no longer just about rules or votes or bylaws. This was nature fighting back, and we were all caught in the middle. And deep down, I knew something none of them did yet. This wasn't the peak of the flood. It was just the beginning, no? One saw the moment the dam broke, not with their eyes, but we all heard it. It happened at 3:47 a.m., 2 nights after the crack first appeared. I was lying in bed, half asleep, listening to the rain tap against the windows like tiny warnings from the sky. That week had been nothing but gray skies and anxious pacing. The creek had swollen like a bruise, and the neighborhood felt like it was teetering on the edge of something no HOA regulation could stop. And then crack. A deep gut-punching boom that shook the walls of my house and sent birds scattering into the black sky. At first I thought it was thunder, until the ground rumbled like a truck had driven through my backyard. I threw on a jacket and rushed outside. What I saw stopped me cold. The dam was gone, not just cracked, obliterated. The cement had fractured in half, split from the center, like nature had driven a wedge right through it. Water poured through the break like it had been waiting, like it had been plotting. It wasn't gentle. It wasn't a stream, it was a roar. The sound was wild, angry, unfiltered. A pent-up tidal wave surging forward with months of pressure. Behind it, trees bent, grass tore, soil peeled up like carpet. The creek, long silenced and imprisoned, had returned with vengeance, and it had chosen a direction, straight through Karen's yard, within minutes. Her garden vanished, washed away, like it had never existed. Decorative stones lifted and floated like cheap bath toys. The koi pond she'd bragged about in the HOA newsletter, gone. Her fence snapped in half like it was made of toothpicks. And then the water reached the house. I watched in frozen silence as the stream surged across her patio and crashed into the rear sliding glass doors. They held for exactly 4 seconds. Then, boom, the glass shattered, and the water surged inside. Karen had built a luxury basement, complete with wine, fridge, recessed lighting, and an entertainment space that she once claimed was but she hadn't built it to resist revenge. Neighbors emerged in pajamas, slippers, and hoodies, blinking in the floodlights and porch glows. Some held phones up, recording. Others stood with mouths open, eyes wide. No one was laughing. It wasn't funny anymore. It was surreal. A real-life disaster. And it was happening to the woman who had tried to prevent one by creating her own. I moved closer, stepping over the slick, soaking ground toward the edge of the creek. That's when I saw her. Karen stood at the top of the staircase inside her home, just barely visible through the shattered back doors. She was wearing silk pajamas, drenched to the knees. Her hands were gripping the railing. Her face, usually tight, smug, polished, looked pale, hollow. She wasn't screaming. She wasn't issuing orders. She was just watching. Watching as the water tore through her basement. Watching as her rug floated past the laundry room. Watching as bottles from her wine rack clinked and shattered against the wall. And I wondered, just for a moment, if she realized what she had done. To us, not even to herself, but to something bigger. Because when you dam up a natural thing for long enough, it doesn't go away. It builds, it waits, it learns your weak spots, and then it comes back. By sunrise, the water had reached halfway up her basement staircase. Emergency services arrived shortly after, responding to a call she'd made around 4 a.m., but there wasn't much they could do. No lives were in danger. No one was hurt. But her foundation, her brand new waterproof walls, the custom tile, all of it underwater. A fire truck pumped water out of her basement, while the HOA board quietly gathered nearby, avoiding eye contact with everyone. They weren't defending her now. Not this time. The county inspector returned later that morning. I showed him the damage, the flow, the cracked cement, the flooded rooms. He took photos again. He didn't need to speak. The look on his face said enough. By noon, it was official. A federal environmental violation had been confirmed. Karen wasn't just facing public humiliation. She was facing charges. Neighbors came to me in waves throughout the day. Some apologized for not listening sooner. Others offered coffee. One even brought me a pie. I didn't need any of it. What I needed and finally got was clarity. Karen had lost. Not just the battle for the creek. She'd lost the illusion that she could outthink nature with paper and cement. But the damage she caused, that would take longer to undo. The fish that used to dart through the creek hadn't returned yet. The frogs hadn't started chirping. The grass might grow again. The soil might settle. But what Karen had tried to erase, the flow, the balance, the wildness, it couldn't be forced back into existence with good intentions. Nature, like people, heals on its own time. But one thing was certain. It had one. If someone had told me a month ago that Karen's luxury basement would end up hosting a school of minnows, I wouldn't have believed them. But there I stood on the sidewalk across from her house, watching through the shattered patio doors as 3 tiny silver fish swam in lazy loops just above the soaked tile. It was the kind of moment you never planned for. Not revenge, not sabotage, not even celebration. Just ... silence. Satisfaction. The purest form of justice, organic, unforced, and ironic enough to make even the most reasonable neighbor smirk. The community was already calling it Karen's Aquarium. Her basement, once featured in the HOA newsletter as a model of tasteful, entertaining space, had turned into something closer to a flooded exhibit at SeaWorld, minus the dolphins. There were empty wine bottles floating in the corner, the remnants of a tipped bar cart, bobbing gently like forgotten memories. Plush furniture had turned to sponges. A beanbag chair had half sunk like the Titanic. But the most incredible part, fish. Real, living, wild fish. Where had they come from? Maybe they'd gotten swept into the current when the dam broke. Maybe they'd been lurking upstream all along, just waiting for the water to return. But now, somehow, they'd found their way into the hollow of her perfect carpeted kingdom, and they seemed oddly at home there. Word spread quickly. Kids on bikes, road laps, around the cul-de-sac just to sneak a peek at the fish tank house. Someone started a fake Instagram account at HOA Aquarium. It had 200 followers by the end of the day. My favorite post, a picture of a soggy throw pillow with the caption, "Live, laugh, lake." Karen, of course, was nowhere to be seen. After the fire department had finished pumping water and the county had filed its report, she disappeared into the upper floor of her house like a ghost. Curtains drawn, lights off, no clipboard in sight. The woman who once went door-to-door measuring hedge heights was now a recluse in a half-drowned mansion. Even the HOA board began to unravel without her presence. The vice president, a nervous man named Howard who'd only joined for the free donuts at meetings, quietly stepped down. Others resigned within the week. No one wanted to be associated with the incident, which now had its own tab in the Nextdoor app's gossip section. Some tried to spin it. She was only doing what she thought was best for drainage. One neighbor offered weakly. Maybe the county gave her the wrong info, said another. But most had stopped defending her, because it wasn't just about the water, or the cement, or the fish. It was about the arrogance. Karen had tried to rewrite the rules of nature and the neighborhood to fit her idea of control, and in doing so, she'd created something worse than chaos. She'd created a spectacle. I'll never forget walking past her property one morning and seeing a handwritten sign taped to the shattered back door, "No trespassing. This is not a joke." And right beneath it, in someone else's handwriting, "Tell that to the fish." That day, a county truck arrived to inspect the remains of the dam. The crew took core samples, bagged debris, and made notes about the structural flaws. I asked one of the engineers what they thought. He just shook his head. "Concrete can't stop a watershed," he said. "It just delays the inevitable." When he walked off, I scribbled that line down. I knew I'd use it again. The final straw came a week later. Karen emerged. She stepped outside just after dawn, dressed in rubber boots and a heavy coat despite the heat. She carried a broom, the same one she used to sweep imaginary dirt from her perfectly paved driveway, but now she used it to push water toward a gutter. as if she could still save something. That's when she saw the fish again. One of them was gliding near the edge of the sunken couch, tail flicking gently. Karen froze, not in fear, not in rage, but in complete, stunned silence. She just stared. It wasn't the water. She'd seen water before, lived through floods, blamed others, moved on. But this was different. This was life returning without her permission. Nature staking its claim. The wild refusing to be tamed. It broke her. I saw her drop the broom and walked. Back inside, she didn't come out again. The county cited her for environmental violations 2 weeks later. She was fined. Her property value plummeted. The HOA was forced to dissolve temporarily while a third-party agency investigated the forged meeting minutes and illegal dam construction. The fish, they stayed for a while. Not many, just a handful, but long enough to become legend. By the end of the summer, the creek had returned to its original path, flowing freely again. Grass regrew. The frogs returned. One afternoon, I even saw a dragonfly skim the surface of the water, like it had never been gone. Karen's basement remained water-stained and abandoned. She never repaired it, never tried to reclaim her status. By autumn, her house went up for sale. The listing conveniently omitted any mention of the flood. Locals knew better. No one made an offer. Not at first. And as for me, I rebuilt the edge of the creek, gently, respectfully. No cement, no borders. Just a few well-placed stones and a bench where I could sit in the mornings, coffee in hand, listening to the water flow. The creek had a voice again, and sometimes, if I sat still enough, I could swear I heard it laugh. There's a stillness that comes after chaos. A quiet so deep, it doesn't feel like silence. It feels like the earth taking a breath. That's what the neighborhood became. Once the fish were gone, the flooded basement dried, and the laughter died down. What remained wasn't noise. It wasn't even gossip. It was a kind of peace we hadn't known in years. Karen was gone, not dead, not jailed. Just gone. She left in the middle of the night. Moving trucks backed into her driveway under a veil of fog. No goodbyes, no notice, no apologies. One neighbor swore she saw Karen staring out the back window of a U-Haul as it pulled away. Eyes locked on the creek, not in anger, not in regret, but in something closer to surrender. Her house sat empty. For months, potential buyers came and went, all of them informed, discreetly or otherwise, about its soggy history. The basement still bore the waterline across the walls like a scar. No amount of paint could hide it. Eventually a young couple with no ties to the HOA bought it. They turned the basement into a garden greenhouse, open air and water fed. They let the land breathe. They didn't talk about Karen. No one really did anymore. But every once in a while, someone would joke about the fish tank or say, "Remember when the HOA president tried to sue a river?" And we'd laugh, not to mock, but to remind ourselves how fragile control really is. For me, life returned to normal. Maybe better than normal. The creek flowed stronger than before, carving its way back through the softened soil, freer now without the dam. The frogs came back, the birds too. And one afternoon, as I sat on the bench I built overlooking the water, I saw something I hadn't seen in over a year, a blue heron gliding low across the surface. Wings wide like sails. It landed just downstream and stood in the shallow bend, still as a statue, watching, waiting, a sentinel of balance restored. I'd watched it for a long time. There was a lot I could have done after Karen left. I could have sued the HOA for damages. I could have written an op-ed. I could have chased my 15 minutes of local fame, but I didn't. Not because I didn't want justice, but because I already had it. The creek was flowing. The community had learned. And Karen, she got something. Deeper than a fine or a headline, she got forgotten. Because that's the worst fate for someone like her, someone obsessed with control, image, and authority. She didn't just lose a battle, she lost her voice, her legacy, her place in the narrative. The HOA disbanded entirely within the year. The bylaws were shredded. The neighborhood reorganized under a loose volunteer committee focused on things that actually mattered: potholes, trash collection, community cookouts. People started talking again, sharing tools, swapping seeds, planting trees. It turns out that when the rules collapse, the people bloomed on. Funny, isn't it? All that Karen ever wanted was to make the neighborhood better by controlling it, and yet, the neighborhood only became better after she left it alone. There's a lesson in that. Not just about water, or power, or overreach, but about the danger of believing you can shape the world in your own image without listening to what it already is. Karen didn't lose because I outsmarted her. She lost because she never once stopped to listen to the creek, to the neighbors. Too common sense. She mistook silence for compliance. But silence was just the calm before the flood. 1 year later, almost to the day, I walked down to the edge of the creek with a thermos of coffee and a notebook. The sun had just come up, and the water was smooth, clear, alive. I stood at the place where the cement had once been, now just soft earth and wildflowers. In the distance, I saw movement, not a fish, not a bird. A child, maybe 7 or 8, standing by the water with a homemade paper boat. She set it gently in the current and watched it drift. Her father stood behind her, hand on her shoulder, smiling quietly. They weren't worried about property lines or drainage reports. They were just being there, letting the world do what it does best, flow. And I realized that's what victory really looks like. Not headlines, not punishment, not revenge, just restoration, a world set right. By doing nothing more than stepping aside and letting it breathe. Karen wanted power. Nature wanted balance. One tried to build a wall, the other waited. And, in the end, the water always wins.